Welcome back, everybody. It is Wins Above Fantasy, episode 161. Today is Thursday, November 14th. If you're joining on the podcast, if you're joining on the live stream, welcome. Van Burnett, joined as always by Steve Giswelli. Got a fantastic show tonight, talking PLV projections, straight from the mothership of Pitcher List, and Kyle Bland dropped the PLV projection list. We'll be going through talking about hitter standouts, pitcher standouts. A lot of fun tonight. As always, you guys can follow us on Twitter at WinsAbovePod. I'm Van_verified. Steve is at Stav8818. And you guys can follow us on Blue Sky as well. That is Wins Above Fantasy, or at Van-verified and at Stav8818. Steve, fantastic recording a couple days ago with Mr. Nick Pollock for our first ever too early mock from Pitcher List, where we kind of got equal parts of grilling from Nick and got to back some of our picks. That'll be dropping on the main feed as well in the coming days. But in the meantime, we are here to talk about PLV projections and very excited about it. I know the Steamer projections have come out, but this is a little bit different slice of data. Of course, looking at pitch level data and some of the projections. We'll get into the considerations. There are plenty of surprises that come with, things to note, because not all of this is gospel, if you will, of what will happen for the year. But we will point out the ones that look very interesting compared to typical ADP. Very excited to talk, Steve. I'm here on the outskirts of St. Louis on a little work shoot. So this is a hotel room podcast for me, but it's always good keeping our rhythm, keeping our schedule. How's it going out there, man?
Great, man. Glad this is it feels like the regular season for us, right? 2 pods in 3 days for us.
Let's go.
We're in overdrive mode right now, but it's exciting. Projection season is always fun. I know I'm starting to see a lot more draft boards, a lot of gladiator drafts, DCs that are out there. So we're slowly creeping into it. I saw Vlad Sedler tweet earlier today or post on Blue Sky that, essentially fantasy baseball has become a 365 day all year thing. It was normally a delay. Projections would come out in like December, and Kyle was on top of it. I think this was released during the playoffs, honestly, during the World Series. So he wastes little time in getting a projection out, and honestly, it's probably up there with one of the more trustworthy projections. I know that I personally lean towards BADX because that had StatCast data, but PLV projections have PLV data, so there's just as much of a reason, if not more than any other projection, to use the ones that Kyle created in PLV. So I wanted to have him on this episode. He couldn't make it, but we are going to have him on at some point soon in the off season. So maybe we can get into like the weeds of like what the projections, how the projections come to be. But for this, I think we can look at it from like a fantasy analyst lens and break down projections that we're buying, selling, interesting guys that we may not have been interested in, but the projections, PLV projections, like them. But yeah, the fact that this uses pitch level data and all of the research that Kyle does and models that he creates, the amazing work that he does, it speaks for itself. And it I don't need to tell you that this is a good projection system because of all the work that Kyle does. So one of the many, many reasons why you should sign up for PL Pro and get access to this.
Yeah, and we can link the article, kind of the lead-in article, before you got to get to the PL Pro to get through the the paywall, if you will, and actually see the spreadsheet, which is awesome, and one of many reasons, like you're saying, Steve, to get in on PL Pro. But we'll do the breakdown on the article itself. You can read kind of the disclaimers of this. That I think the biggest disclaimer is playing time is standardized or kind of maximized, where hitters are given 600 plate appearances and starters are given 160 innings, relievers 60 innings as well. So you kind of have to take that with a dose of, I don't know, like a Shane Boz and a Workhorse are getting the same amount of projected volume, or maybe a platoon hitter that rakes is getting that assumption of 600 plate appearances. So some of these come with considerations, but it's also an interesting exercise because of that. Because to your point on a recent episode, Steve, where you were mentioning how difficult it is to project out playing time as it relates to starting pitchers and injuries. And even we got into the discussion of Jacob deGrom, and that's kind of the extreme scenario. But who's to say that Jacob deGrom won't go 160? And who's to say a Logan Gilbert workhorse is a lock for 195 innings? Like that type of mentality kind of gets the playing field gets leveled when you look at this data, which, again, you can't kind of copy and paste this as expected outcomes for next year, because there is a level of durability that you have to factor in to some extent. But I still think it's really cool to look at these and say, kind of ceteris paribus, to drop some Latin on the podcast, all things equal, how would these guys perform next to one another? And that is something we don't always look at. So even though it's kind of a detriment of the projection system, I think it's also a cool lens to look at. Beyond the playing time, Kyle's done an awesome job of weighting the type of things that you would want to weight across these projections. For instance, home run to fly ball, he mentions, is a noisy stat, whereas K percentage is a stronger indicator of talent. So certain things like that, I don't know if you want to add to it, Steve, but there's definitely elements of this that are not just looking at last year's back of the baseball card, or even taking 3 years of data and summarizing it. It's definitely going a level deeper to say, what trends actually are sticky, and how does that bake into the projections?
Yeah, I forget the first name of the like one of the first projection systems, but Saris of the Athletic always brings it up. Like, it was literally just like a weight of a player's last 3 years or 5 years, and like year one was weighted 40%, year two was weighted 30%, year three was weighted 20%, and like that was a projection system. That was how the model worked, and like was like fine.
It's a
like,
way to do it. It's a way to
yeah,
do
it's
it.
a way to do it, but like that was like the nebulous of projections. But Kyle, having made all of these amazing and predictive models, knows which factors to weight, and basically does all that stuff that's super smart people do in baseball modeling and baseball, making baseball projections, and does that for you and accounts for it. Like, I think that sometimes people forget that projections is like an amalgamation of all of these tools that we look at. Like, especially in an advanced system like this, like it's going to like if you're looking at, Fernando Tatis's projections has him for 38 homers, but his barrel rate, but I think his barrel rate is going to be 19%. Like, I'm going to project him for more or less. Like, well, the projections are accounting for that. Like, they have these things in them, and they're weighted in a way that makes them more predictive than just
The average
Joe
Joe
Schmo looking at a savant page. Not that there isn't any value to that, but the projections try to do that and average it out and give you a baseline of what to expect. So it's a great tool. I've relied on projections heavily, like early on, as I became interested in just analyzing fantasy baseball and getting better at it, and always will use it. It's one of the most important tools in my draft prep, or just anything that I would do as far as research for a podcast, an article, advice, whatever. And PLV projections are going to be ones that I trust the most, not just because I have a podcast on the Pitcherless Podcast Network.
For sure. And I think especially and Kyle's got even a tab of updates to this, like an update log or a change log on the spreadsheet, where throughout the year, we'll be going, or throughout the off season, we'll be going back and updating based on new information, all that stuff. So you do have to couch it at the fact that here we are in mid-November. This is, again, in the grand scheme of things, what I would call early off-season prep, beginning to form opinions that you can challenge throughout the off-season. But there's some fun stuff in here. Like, I was scrolling through the names, and this will be a loose show by intention because there's no way we're going to get through 200 plus names on this. But the way we've kind of split it out has been hitter standouts on the good side, on the bad side, and then pitcher standouts on the good side, on the bad side. So any final thoughts, Steve, on how to make sense of some of this data before we jump in, or do we just want to kind of wade into the waters and talk about some interesting names and maybe challenge what, why they're so high or so low, and talk about, if it was eye-opening for us?
The last thing that I want to say, and I know you plugged it, but just go read Kyle's primer on it. It's not like a long article or anything like that, but it just shows you like his thought process and does a better job explaining than you and I do,
For sure.
or at least me, into what makes these projections special and unique, and what makes Kyle's projections Kyle's. So
Yes.
be sure to check that out. It'll be linked in the show notes here.
Absolutely. And I mean, to summarize the bullets themselves, like just if you're following and can follow, he talks about that each metric has a different impact for projecting. So stolen base attempt rates rely on the most recent year results, where pitcher ground ball rates are more even weighting over the last 3 seasons. And again, that's not a random decision. That's Kyle going off of what is a sticky
year to
trend.
year. Yeah.
Yep. And then he talks, we mentioned the home run to fly ball rate, for example, is noisy, whereas K percentage is a better indicator of like a pitcher's talent, or possibly a hitter's as well. And then the last one is that each projected metric has a different balance of using results versus using stuff that's under the hood. So, for instance, a pitcher's walk rate results have a higher weighting for projecting them out, while underlying metrics make up a larger share of their strikeout rate. So if there's swinging strike rate or velocity or extension, and all of the stuff that, to your point, Steve, we look at as typical, on their pitcher list page or a Savant page, those have different levels of what feels like you can trust the back of the baseball card versus stuff that have stronger indicators underneath. But yes, Kyle breaks all this down, and it is a very short, 4-paragraph type of read. And so that brings us to the list, and starting with the hitter standouts. And Steve, the floor is open because we got the spreadsheet in front of us, but to kind of rattle them off, the good standouts, as in these are names that popped off on the rankings that he had in terms of like 5x5 value weight, compared to where their general ADP is. And again, to list them off, we got Yordan Alvarez 3rd overall. Brent Rooker was a shocker that made me look twice, 8th overall. Corey Seager 9th. Now, again, you got to think about this is a guarantee of 600 plate appearances. And the same applies, same disclaimer there for Kerry Carpenter, who is 15th.
And this is overall by 5x5 value, right? That's what this is sorted on.
Yes. So, and I guess that would be a question. It's 5x5 value proxy is how this is sorted. But I would be curious, if Kyle is on, are we saying that is, how are we defining 5x5 value? Is that like a war?
I take it as like, this is the auction. This is the projection system's auction calculator value.
Okay. So, but still a true value. So in a vacuum, Brent Rooker, they're saying, is the 8th overall hitter.
Yeah. I mean,
which is,
he's projected for an 856 OPS with, 29 homers, 8 steals, right? I mean,
pretty much 90-90 on runs, RBIs. Yeah. So it's just, it is interesting though. So so we got Rooker, Seager, Kerry Carpenter, which comes with a platoon disclaimer, but then Marcell Ozuna was 12th on this list, and that's one that we took in the mock. Spoiler alert, that we briefly talked about. We grabbed him in the 4th round, so 12th overall bat on this projection system. Seiya Suzuki, 32nd. Lawrence Butler, 34th, which I think would be a bargain on where we got him in the mock, around pick 100. Jake Berger, I thought was interesting, Steve, going 40th, because we grabbed Mark Vientos, and I was kind of teasing that out of like, what other third basemen are out there? Was that early? Could we have waited 4 or 5 rounds? And I saw Jake Berger go like a handful of rounds later, and I was like, yeah, but I would much rather have Vientos. And I think in a vacuum I would. But if that is the discount of 4 or 5 rounds, I went and looked closer at what Berger did and the stuff under the hood. And I was kind of eye-opened, because he is one that I feel like the name value isn't there. Like, there's not a lot of hype, and the production is kind of sneaky. And then I thought Tyler Fitzgerald, because we grabbed him pretty late, around pick 200, thought it was just interesting that he was 75th on this. Maybe that's in line with his ADP, but his projections had him around 20 homers, which I think was that question mark of like, okay, if his raw sprint speed is up there with the Ellie De La Cruzes of the league at, 99th percentile, are we predicting him to be a 15 homer guy, or do we think that this is like a guy that could realistically pop for a 2040 season if everything goes his way? And to see that they believed in the pop on the PLV projections, kind of further, it's like confirmation bias, but those were some standouts I threw out. We definitely can look in on from that list, like what their actual projections are, or we can scan the rest of the list. It's a pretty loose show rundown for good reason, because this is the sandbox. But talk to me about what stands out to you with this, or if you want to kind of zigzag across some other names, Steve.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to hit on a bunch of names that you just went through. The first being Yordan Alvarez. I think,
so, yeah. What are we looking at for his projections here?
He is projected, and again across 600 plate appearances, for 32 homers, 91 RBIs, 295, 377, 551 for 928 OPS. I think that's a solid floor for Yordan Alvarez. And Chris Towers was talking about, of CBS, was talking about how 4 category studs are underrated in today's game because of how plentiful stolen bases are. Just early in the draft, just middle of the draft, late in the draft. Like, you don't have to take essentially the Billy Hamiltons, the Story Ruizes of the world, to basically suffer in every other category but steals, and roster those guys, because now with the stolen base environment, good hitters run, and bad hitters run more. Stolen bases are just found everywhere, so you're not as pigeonholed if you take a guy like Yordan Alvarez or like Juan Soto in the early rounds, who you're essentially going to pencil in a 0 for stolen bases. So I think Alvarez is, even though he hasn't had a Judge-like season, I think he has a Judge-like season in him. And by that, I mean, like, a 50-plus homer season. Like, Alvarez hasn't hit, what's his career high for homers? I think it's like 39?
37.
37. Yeah, that is shocking that Yordan Alvarez has not hit 40 homers yet. I know there's been a few seasons with injuries. The most games he ever played was last year at 147, but like, there's going to be a 40-plus homer season for Alvarez. There may even be a 50-plus homer season for Alvarez one of these years. And I'm willing to buy it. If he goes anywhere like towards the back end of the first round, I think that is a great buy.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the projections compared to what he did just this past season, he did eclipse the 600 plate appearance mark for the first time of his career, and it was 635, and that led to 35 homers. He hit 308, which this new projection has that average coming down 13 points to 295, which to your point, Steve, this kind of feels like a floor projection. The only thing that's coming up from last year, because the homers they have coming down, is runs and RBIs, which we know is kind of a weird Astros season in terms of like the overall offensive output and everything. But yeah, I think when you look at what he did a couple years back, just 114 games and 31 homers, you know, that kind of pace, just like the real simple pro rating, that is a 40 homer season. You just needed the health. But we're looking at 3 seasons in a row where his median average was more like 300 than the 295 that they got him at. So yeah, it's a good point that if you can get speed late, you're looking at a guy that should help across the board and be almost like a, I don't know, like a Vlad Guerrero or like a Juan Soto or even Freddie Freeman when he was delivering more regular season homers. So yeah, I like it. I was just surprised to see on the weighting scale him land above like a Bobby Witt Jr., although I guess they've just got him for 25 homers, 29 steals. So that's a little bit lower, but yeah, it caught my attention right away. That's for sure.
It's early and it's draft and hold season. So like, and gladiator season. So, you know, gladiator has 23 roster spots, 0 roster moves. DCs have, you know, deep benches and no weekly moves. So you can't add steals essentially. So yeah, Alvarez's price may be a little bit depressed, but he's the 18th player off the board right now at NFBC. That's
Feels like a bargain.
Firmly in the second round. And just looking at the board, like, yeah, I could easily say that may rise, but I don't see who he's going to jump past. Like, players immediately in front of him are Lindor, Vlad Guerrero, Julio Rodriguez, Corbin Carroll, Ronald Acuna, Tariq Skubals above him. Like, maybe Zach Wheeler gets bumped up too. So I think he's going to stay in that range just by the sheer fact that I don't see many people that he's going to pass.
Well, and looking at
what's really interesting is the next outfielder behind him is Jackson Churio. Jackson Churio is going 20th overall in NFBC right now.
Well, absolutely. And I think looking at the actual PLV data projections, it's definitely notable that in the top, let's say top 100 of these players, they actually only have 3 players projected for over 30 home runs, which is crazy. And that's Alvarez, Ohtani, and Judge. So even like, you know, as we get to some other names that have lofty home run projections, or even like a Mike Trout, given 600 plate appearances, they have it 29. So it does seem like homers are depressed a little bit on the model. And Alvarez is the only player on this entire list that has a projected by PLV pitch level projection, a 295 average with over 30 homers. So that just goes to show that they are valuing him as the elite hitter, like you've been saying for years, Steve, is he's one of the best actual hitters in the majors. And I think that's what this says more than anything, even if the numbers, of course, there will probably be more, you know, I guess Ozuna they have for 30 homers as well. But yeah, 4 people, more than 4 players in the top 100 are going to eclipse the 30 homer mark. But yeah, it's just really interesting that even if you're kind of grading off the curve, what he does in terms of power and average is in a league of one.
It's just him. It's really there's if you had to pick one player to hit, you know, 290 with 30 homers, you pick Jordan Alvarez. Like, he is like as amazing as Ohtani and Judge are, there's a lot more strikeouts in their game and a lot more average fluctuation. I know Judge maybe is kind of establishing himself in the more of the Jordan Alvarez territory. But, you know, Ohtani had, this is literally picking the smallest of nits with him, but there was a stretch at the end of the middle of the season where Ohtani was hitting like, 230 or something like that. It didn't matter because he was like homering every day, but like he strikes out a lot and has some batting average fluctuation. Jordan Alvarez is like a pure hitter, as well as a power hitter. Like, like as Vlad Guerrero sort of is and Bobby Witt is, but they don't have the 40 homer power upside that Alvarez has. So I think I like Alvarez a lot. I say this every year, and I really don't ever have that many shares of him, but I want the Jordan Alvarez shares. Like I think he's perennially discounted for how good he actually is.
Yeah, that's fair. And speaking of discounts, we moved to Brent Rooker, who's surprise number 2 on this list, and all the disclaimers you gave about ADP, Steve, which are valid. Rooker is the 45th hitter off the board, yet on the PLV projections, he is the number 8 hitter. So that right away is looking at an even larger discount relative to the draft cost than we just talked about with Alvarez. And Rooker's projections are a 268 average, 29 homers, which again, I think you almost have to grade with the curve and think, okay, well, if they got judged for 41, then Rooker's 29, presumably it could be more like a 35. 8 steals as well, so not a 0 on speed, and then the same runs and RBIs as Alvarez, pretty much, at least what he did this year. So 89 runs, 89 RBIs. And yeah, when you look at Rooker, is it time to start viewing a guy that, again, early ADP has as util, like 7th rounder, somewhere in that range? Is it time for us to start viewing him as like a bona fide top 50 guy, or do we feel like there's more to break down here? Because we've now seen a couple seasons from Rooker where it was like, okay, is it a true breakout? He had 30 homers in 23. And then last year he goes off for 39 homers with a 293 average and an XBA that was solid at 269. So talk to me about Rooker. Like, are we overlooking this guy as an absolute outfielder 1, or are we kind of concerned that this might be hyping him up too much?
I think so. Like Rooker is going to be a divisive player, and he's like the perfect like blind resume game guy. Like, if you put out player A, over the last 2 years with all of his stats, right, you're gonna say what's his ADP, and you'll say in the top 2 rounds, but he's not, because it's Brent Rooker and the track record and the fact that, like, I think he was DFA'd by Minnesota, like is older, was essentially free like 2 years in a row. And shout out to my buddy Rich in our home league. He had an amazing season, just missed the playoffs, but had an amazing turnaround in part because of Rooker. But like he picked him up essentially after he was dropped after a slow start or something. And it's like, there's no way that I'm paying for him. I'm like, he's like, where is he going to go next year? And like, this was before the season ended. I'm like, I don't know, around 5, 6. And he was like, no way I'm paying that price. There's just a bias against these types of guys that are late breakouts that you may not fully believe, but everything about Brent Rooker's profile makes me believe that he is a 260, 35 homer bat. Like, he has this 15.6% barrel rate in 2023, 16.6% last year, 50% hard hit rate 2 years in a row. Like, he cut the strikeout rate by 4 points. He takes a walk. Like, sure, I don't think he's going to run a 362 BABIP again, but I mean, he ran a 23% homer to fly ball rate this year, 22% last year. Like, it's probably going to be 20 again this year. So
yeah,
I think that there's just it's ageist, it's late breakout. I don't believe it. Another DH only. I'm in on Brent Rooker for next year, man.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with the price. Yes, the Ks are still a concern. Last year they were right under 29%, but you hear Nick always refer to ICR, which is ideal contact rate, barrels, solids, flares, and burners, which are great, divided by total batted ball events. He's 96th percentile on ICR. The barrel rate is 97%. So yes, the K rate is an issue. But when he
hits the ball, yeah,
there's a reason why the BABIP is running 362 last year. So yeah, you're not getting the 293 hit last year, but you're probably getting, I'm betting on it being better than the 246 average from the year before. And he did all that last year, 39 homers, 11 steals with 145 games. So there's even a little bit of volume if he can stay healthy and just be available. He's just 30 years old. So even though he was a late breakout, it's not like he's, on the decline in terms of like physical skills to where it's noteworthy. So yeah, I mean, realistically, he's 8th on this list. Is he the 8th hitter? Of course not. But if he's the 45th hitter off the board, it makes you think twice about.
He doesn't need to finish 8th. Yeah.
Yeah. Why are we taking Kyle Schwarber over Rooker? Like that, I think that's a valid question. So yeah, that's just, that's Rooker. We can't spend so much time on all these guys, but across the other ones, Steve, is there one or two you want to pick out between Seager, Kerry Carpenter, Ozuna? We just talked about Suzuki, Lawrence Butler, Jake Berger, or Fitzgerald is a deep shot, but I think I already kind of hit on what's interesting there. 22 homers, 26 steals. I think he could easily eclipse 30 steals with his speed. But who else are you interested in before we look at kind of the flip of this, which is some of the ones devalued?
I think Kerry Carpenter will be next year's Brent Rooker. There's a bold take for November 13th at 10 o'clock.
So what do we do with the splits with Carpenter is the question, because they weren't that bad, but they still didn't play.
And he did not play versus lefties. I think that he is so good. And the Tigers, like we talked about in the episode with Nick on the corner, they got that taste. They made the postseason. They went on a run. I think there comes a point where teams need to just let good hitters play every day.
Mm-hmm.
And, I understand wanting to get the most out of every at bat, and each game is important in the moment, and you want to get advantages. But I think you just need to let your best hitters play all the time. And maybe this is me just wish casting, but I could see Kerry Carpenter is good enough to warrant, hey, let's see if this guy can play every day. And I'm hoping that they'll at least give him a shot. And even if they don't, like, he still has, he had 18 homers in 87 games. Like he missed a lot of time with injury. He missed like 2-3 months with injury.
Yeah. Back inflammation.
He still has a strong side platoon, so you could pencil him in for, 500 plate appearances, being conservative about that. So, he's 16th on, with 600 plate appearances. They have him, by PLV as like the 8th most home runs in the league. Like, yes, he could finish top 10 in homers even if he does platoon.
What's crazy looking at Kerry Carpenter, because he actually, you're right. I mean, he was on the 60-day IL last year. If you go to 2023, he stayed healthy, but he made major strides this year. So 2023, he had 118 games. This year, he had 30 less games, and he only hit 2 less home runs. So when you look at like year-to-year changes, his barrel rate jumped from 10% up to 17.7%. So he immediately, like, he went from, basically went from like middle of the road,
like good, good
barrel rate up to basically like 99th percentile on barrel rate. So yeah, I think if he is healthy and they look at everything he did this year, why not roll him out? Or at the minimum, like you're saying, you're just getting an absolute stud for whatever 4 out of 6 games,
and it's that super high barrel rate with only a 25% strikeout rate, not a 30% like some of these other super high end sluggers.
Yep. Well, if you guys want to hear us talk about Butler or Fitzgerald or Ozuna, we do it on the podcast with Nick, where we break those guys down. I think maybe the last thing I want to punch in on real quick is Jake Berger, like I mentioned, because Steve, he was another guy that what we saw last year was a remix of what he did in 2023, where now we have 2 seasons in a row with a 250 average and more or less 30 home runs in each of the years. So yes, it's kind of this oatmeal-y production, but he's just 28 years old, and all of the underlying stuff minus the plate discipline looks really impressive. And yeah, you go to Berger on this list, and they've got him for 27 homers, which again, I think you can lift up just with the curve, 255 average. So it actually comes up, and solid runs and RBIs. What's most interesting about Berger is the cost, because he is going at ADP 132, the 77th hitter off the board. And on this list, they have him at the 40th hitter in terms of value. So are you interested at all in Berger being undervalued just because he's not the most exciting name?
Is Jake Berger the new Chris Davis with a K?
I was going to say like Christian Walker. Yeah.
The last 3 seasons, 250, 250, 250 for his batting average.
Just a metronome.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. I mean, the OBP is remarkably close too. 302, 309, 301. It just, the slug was a little bit lower than last season. 5 less homers, I'm sure, a good amount less doubles. And yeah, that does manifest itself in that drop in barrel rate and a little bit drop in hard hit percentage. But Berger was like pretty much unrostered. If I'm going to pull up the splits now, but he was not great in the first half, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he hit 255 with just 10 homers, and then hit 19 homers and hit 278, 279 in the second half. So 9 more homers in 9 less games for Berger. I know second half splits aren't the end all be all, but I'm not saying that he's that hitter in the second half. I think he's the 250, 30 homer hitter. That maybe if he isn't as ice cold as he was to start the season, he has an OPS closer to 800. I think this is an amazing third base pick if you wait on it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think maybe on it. We could have. I'm not saying that I don't like the Vientos pick, but we could have pivoted and put a pin in Jake Berger for someone that may be a good option a little bit later on. And like, is he going to be on the Marlins next year? Like, they're going to trade him this offseason, right?
Yeah, it feels like he doesn't fit with what they're doing when you look at
or is he, I guess he is in arbitration, so like it's like pre-arb even, so like it's a super cheap deal, so maybe not. Like he made $760K last year.
Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about Vientos and some other guys on kind of the wrong side of these projections, but we're going to take an ad break. We'll be right back after this. Okay, so Steve, we probably got to move through the bad ones as well. I think the exciting ones are easier to spend more time on, but worth noting that some players that don't look as much of a value on this PLV projection chart. Trey Turner, the 37th hitter. Corbin Carroll, 45th hitter. Jaron Duran, 55th. Michael Harris II, 79th. Ozzie Albies is probably the biggest faller versus ADP at 89th. Marcus Semien, 130th, which I think in our draft, he was like 6th round for a second base positional need. And then Vientos, who we got in like the top 80, he's 138th on this hitter chart. Again, this is where, if we had Kyle on, he would probably talk through the conditions that led to this. But I guess we can punch in on any of these guys. Overall, are there any big takeaways here or ones that you're taking a second look at?
I mean, guys like Trey Turner and Marcus Semien, like those are guys that not that I'm afraid of, but I'm afraid of, being caught holding the hot potato. Or, I'd rather be a year, like I'm in the mode of, I'd rather be a year early of fading them and then have a good season than be stuck with them when like the decline fully starts to happen. And like we've seen Trey Turner have a really bad half 2 years ago when he first went to Philadelphia. Marcus Semien, when he first went to Texas, had that slow first 2 months where he was hitting like below 200. I mean, he exploded for the rest of the season. But then, last year was, an OPS below 700. I know there was some injury in there, and Simeon's a guy that like does not miss time and plays through injury. He actually like sat a day or two due to the injury, and it was a big deal. Never even went on the IL, and his numbers kind of dropped off from that. But it's much more difficult to project bounce backs when these guys start to get older. So those are two guys that I've normally loved. Like I feel like Trey Turner and Marcus Simeon, two of the guys that I've rostered the most over the last like 3, 4, 5 years of playing fantasy baseball. But that means that they're starting to get up there in age, and it's much harder to project bounce backs as you get older. I think Jeff Zimmerman of Fangraphs has done a bunch of research on that. So yeah, I would qualify both those seasons as sort of, underperformances. And the fact that Trey Turner, despite having elite sprint speed, like isn't really a lock for even 20 stolen bases anymore, I think hurts his value a lot. So I'm kind of like, those are two names that I'm kind of out on.
Yeah, I mean, neither one of them are ones that I'm like chasing after, but with second base, I was curious about Semien. I think Turner, I'm okay skipping. I guess one, speaking of second base, that we got to spend time with briefly is Ozzie Albies, who on the projections here, they have on 600 plate appearances, 18 homers, 11 steals, and a 256 average, which would not be close to getting it done. And I guess that in large part is because last year in 100 games, we saw 10 homers, 8 steals. But just 1 year ago, we saw 33 homers, 13 steals, and a 280 average. So I don't really know what's all feeding into this. I mean, I know batted ball data doesn't look great. But are we ready to just in a vacuum? Do you think you'll be in on Albies like this? I was concerned to see this far of a drop on projections here.
Albies goes high because of how, I mean, he is a great player, but he does get inflated because of like position scarcity and the fact that second base is a landmine. And Ketel Marte in our mock draft went like 14th overall or 15th overall, something like that. And I'm not interested in paying that premium that, or I understand the logic behind it and not having to worry about that position for the rest of the way. But
yeah,
I've missed out on good Ozzie Albies years because of that, essentially. Like, yeah, guys that I project to be, and maybe that's a flaw in my game, and it's a reason why in some of those mock drafts I end up with 3 outfielders in the first 5 rounds or something like that, because I'm just focused on taking the best hitter. But I'm a little bit more conscious of position value, but still focused on guys that I want a little more and think are better overall. Like, where's Albies going in this early NFBC data?
48th.
Radio. Okay, so it's a little bit later than he normally goes.
Yeah, it's usually like 2-3.
Yeah. But yeah, and I guess there's guys that are around him that are reasonable. So I think I like him for where he's going. Like, normally when Albies would go around like Alvarez, Jazz, Devers, like I'm taking Devers, Jazz, Harper. Like I was like, that's why I never had any shares of Albies. I'll take. I think I may have a share of Albies at pick 50 overall. I think that's fair.
If he stays there. Okay.
If he stays there, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's switch over to pitchers, Steve, and spend a little time on the good standouts here. Get ready, folks. Blake Snell, first overall on this list. Yusei Kikuchi, 7th overall. Dylan Cease, 11th. Just kind of reassuring that Cease as a top SP and not like a cherry bomb, despite some volatility. Yamamoto, 12th. Bryce Miller, 13th. Schwellenbach, 18th. I think, again, this kind of reinforces what we were talking about on our last show, where we were saying maybe we want to jump in and grab at least 2 by pick 100, 110. Brian Wu, 25th on this SP chart. And then you get into kind of the volume based, but David Festa, 34th. That was one I had to double check and make sure that's right, because he is going deep well after pick 200. Shane Boz, 43rd. And then I just thought it was interesting. Chris Paddock's name popped up at 61st. Now that would be SP5 territory, but I still think that's well ahead of kind of where he's normally going. So again, knowing that this is saying everyone is at 160 innings, so it's kind of holding all things equal. What do we want to focus on here? Because got some wild cards in that list.
Yeah, I think just overall, this is going to be one of my favorite tools for research because of the fact that I am sort of throwing injury risk out the window with pitchers this year. Like that's great. I love a 160 inning projection for all these pitchers because I don't know which one's going to hit them. I don't know which one's not. So give me what you think based on the talent. And I understand it. Like Blake Snell, 2 years in a row now, essentially, for the majority of the season was like by far and away the best pitcher. So I'm not surprised that the skills back that up and process for PLV projections back that up. I think it highlights a lot of these guys, like how good they are. Like I feel like projections and pitch level data projections, which is what these are, this is what they're going to do well in. Like I would not be surprised if this ranking is more accurate towards the end of the season than like, ADP, for instance. Like I take this over ADP because I think it does a better job of analyzing the skill and throw the biases out the window. And, especially for pitchers, like it's so hard to project playing time and injuries. And, we saw this with PLV last year and how well the streamers did. Like it beat Nick in picking streamers every day as far as PLV bot using these projections to pick streamers. So I'd have a lot of faith in this. I'm not saying that it's gospel. I don't want to, be scalded by Kyle tomorrow and then say like I'm putting too much pressure on his projections or anything. I mean it in the complimentary of ways, but like, and especially in short samples too. I think if there is a guy like Kikuchi who's ranked 7th, and his ADP among pitchers is closer to probably 30th or 40th. I'm pulling that up right now.
That's the name I'm excited about.
He is the 60th pitcher off the board, so that's including relievers. So probably 50th. Don't take Kikuchi 7th, but take him 30th or 40th. Like bump him up that much, right?
Yes,
like, because that's what the skills are.
Another thing with Kikuchi, not only the discount, but it should hold because of the ageism that happens, and he's 33 years old. But we saw him break out with the Astros to the tune of a 2.70 ERA and a 9.93 WHIP, and the Astros should be bringing him back. A lot of those rumors, and then you look at the volume stuff, and it's like he just threw 175. 2 years ago, he threw 167. So we know Kikuchi can eclipse this 160 inning assumption. Whereas, you look at some other names on this list and it's like, take a David Festa, for instance. And it's like, yeah, I would bet against him throwing 160. And I think they're kind of possibly running the risk of overemphasizing some of his stuff, which he is good and he showed flashes, but we have yet to see Festa like tear through the league. And yet they're projecting him for 178 strikeouts, a 3.58 ERA, and a 1.13 WHIP. Like that would be a massive step forward for Festa to basically put it all together. With a guy like Kikuchi, he's gone on runs like that, and especially most recently as he's continued to kind of fine tune who he is as a pitcher in this league. And we've always thought the potential is there. I just think give this more weight when it's with a veteran who should give you volume, who should be with a pitching factory. And yeah, I'm I am 100% circling Kikuchi at 146 ADP and saying, to your point, Steve, it doesn't need to be pick 70, but pick 120 when he's definitely there. And I'm first in line for him, but he could turn around and be like an SP3, if not better. Like that's value. And I think that's like an early name to like bold on your draft sheet and say, okay, PLV loves him. His extension is great. His team context is great. And he should go volume. There's no reason to handle him with kid gloves. I love Kikuchi of this whole list. Anybody else you want to highlight of the names we talked about? I feel like there's a lot of really good ones here.
Not necessarily, but I think that it has me excited about a lot of these guys. Like it has me excited and it gives me reassurance. Like we talked about Festa, like I feel like nonstop from like August on.
Yeah.
And like it gives me validation that we talked about him and liked him for good reason. I know that there was some innings limitation down the stretch with just how the Twins approached it and how they were using him. But it shows me that the stuff is good and the pitches are good and the data likes him. So that has me excited. Shane Baz too. I think that for him to be this high and had a year where he was coming back from Tommy John after being out for basically over 2 years almost, like, right? It was a longer end of the Tommy John recovery. And to believe of, to think back of when Alex Chamberlain was on this show and was basically, doing the draft day, Christian Mack, no matter what, or with not Christian Mack is pitcher list. Mack, no matter what, I forget what the player's name is in draft day, but we were all saying Shane Baz, no matter what, with how good his stuff is. Like I have to imagine in year 2 back from Tommy John, Shane Baz has better stuff, and that 43rd overall is kind of like a floor.
Yeah. Yeah. For context on Festa, in our pitcher list mock, he went at pick 238 overall, and he's here on the PLV projection as the 35th best pitcher. And you do not have to reach that far. That's
Gray from Rasball, who's a big proponent of like punting early pitching and not drafting early pitching too, always puts out like, here's the rotation I built after pick, 180. David Fest is going to be on like all of those tweets.
Yeah. And shout out to Thomas Nestico, who came on the podcast early last year. And he said, I don't think he'll get any looks in the majors this year, but if and when he does, David Festa is the pitcher I'm most excited about.
So if Kyle Bland and Thomas Nestico like David Festa, like
we will be there.
David Festa. Yeah,
we will be there. I'd be remiss to skip over Schwellenbach because I'm starting to get really excited, Steve, and to see him validated on this list. I know you were in season saying this is the guy to be paying close attention to, but the fact that he was so good with the Braves, and I think his ADP is around like the 105 mark there.
So there's some hype. There's some hype. Yeah.
There's some hype there, but I think for a guy that has like the chase rate, he's got a ton of action with like his slider. This is one that I'm also pretty excited about. And I guess and he threw 123 in the majors, but I think he had enough in the minors to where volume's not a huge concern. But yeah, dude, like he's got 5 pitches, split, curve, cutter, slider, 4-seamer that's 96. Like I think Schwellenbach is a pretty interesting name that should get a lot of wins. And as long as the hype doesn't take over, I'm interested. I mean, I guess he's around a lot of names that are interesting, like a Shane McClanahan, who, if he's healthy, he's going to soar above that.
Sure.
But yeah, it was just, it was confirming to see him on this list that like, he's not an accident at that stage of the draft around guys like Hunter Brown.
No, I think that's a good comp. And I can see them being good pitchers, him and Hunter Brown for sure.
Okay, well, we'll round out with some of the bad standouts and wrap up. We're going to take another ad break, and we'll be right back after this. So Steve brings us to the flip side, and I mentioned Hunter Brown. He's at the kind of the back end of the list here in terms of bad standouts. 68th overall on this list, even though he's being drafted as kind of an SP 2-3, somewhere in there. Some other names that are at the bottom of this list in terms of like the delta of where their ADP is. Aaron Nola is 59th. Freddie Peralta is 50th in terms of pitchers. Corbin Burns, this is a huge fall from like the 5th SP to 41st on this list. And I love that early in the offseason, Steve, you said that's one guy who is on your do not draft list. Max Fried, that's one that feels really solid. And he's 37th here. Same with Logan Gilbert. George Kirby is 24th. Garrett Cole is another one that you said I'd rather be, a year early on jumping off there. He's 23rd. Cole Reagan's 21st, not egregious, but definitely a slide from where he's going. And then Paul Skeen's 14th. So are there any names on this list that you are shocked or surprised or kind of factoring into your overall view of them on your own fantasy boards?
I'm surprised Skeens isn't like number like closer to like Snell. Maybe I know that like recalibrated his Stuff Plus model and like all of his stuff looks much better because if you just look at it on last year's Stuff Plus model, basically everything was pretty meh except for the slider, but that's obviously not the case with how good Skeens is. So maybe there's some of that. So that's going to be a question for when we have Kyle on. Like, why does your projections hate?
They've got him just like good instead of
I mean they got him as the top. Yeah, they got him as good, not top pitcher, which I think he can be. So yeah, I think that
grain of salt there.
Yeah, just a grain of salt. I'm not surprised on Burns or Fried. Fried isn't like the biggest strikeout guy or stuffest in the world. I think he's more of like an oatmeal-y SP1, and I think the fact that he had some injuries last year is a bit of a slow starter, ramped up even a little bit longer. It makes sense. None of these guys I'm like running away from. Maybe Corbin Burns and Freddie Peralta are a little bit.
That's interesting. I wonder where they got his. So they still got the strike. I guess part of Peralta, because they got him at 191 strikeouts on this projection, is you have seen him like this year. He gave you more volume, so he eclipsed.
I mean, the last 2 years he's had 30 and 32 starts, so he's giving you the volume.
It's the whip that's really hurting here for Peralta at a 119 and a 10% walk rate. Was his whip that high this year?
I mean, he had a 9.4% walk rate.
121 whip.
Yeah.
You see him hit the 200 strikeout mark, and you're like, man, what a stud. But that whip is a negative for sure.
Yeah, and like Nick was saying, in our show with him, like 120 whip's like okay, right? Like it's like what the average is like 125, right? Like it's pretty good, but okay and pretty good don't win you the leagues. Like you need a whip closer to that's starts with 1.0 something, right?
Then for a stud.
Then you're cooking.
And a 3.68 ERA in this landscape is like the old 4 ERA. So that's ratios were not good. And
I mean there were still a 28% strikeout rate in 173 innings. The swing strike rate, while it was down a tick from last year, still 13%. So that backs that up. There's still a lot to like. Like the Sierra was 3.78, but I think that in 22 and 23, people would get away with drafting Peralta as like a late SP. Like if this was my strategy, and I would be comfortable with drafting Peralta as my first starting pitcher, as someone that like goes as an SP2 that has SP1 upside. I think he's an SP2 that is going to be an SP2/SP3. So pretty good, but maybe not the upside that he's had in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just looking at pitchers like him that are earlier on the projection model so that you can kind of look at the ADP,
Mhm.
and some ones that jump out are like Jack Flaherty is right there on strikeouts. The whip is kind of a wash, but
And you
the
could probably
ERA
get him
is much
later,
better.
right? Yeah.
Yes, you can get him later. And then the big one is Luis Heel is pretty much a clean swap on strikeout projection. The ERA and the whip are both better.
When we do our draft this, not that, draft Luis Heel, not Freddie Peralta. There you
Because
go.
Freddie Peralta is going at a 88 ADP and Luis Heel is going at a 175. So
Yeah.
100 picks later. And then it all comes down to, okay, well, with Freddie, you just got 173 innings. And with Luis Heel, obviously, you're not counting on 170 from him. But I am curious because the Yankees gave him like that IL stint. I think it was in August, but he threw 151 innings then, and then you roll in postseason as well.
Yeah, he kind of got
And
close
that
to it,
was
right? Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
8. So yeah, we saw 160 for Luis
Yeah.
Heel. So yeah, that is a draft this, not that for sure. So yeah, interesting. Any other names here or any other like big picture thoughts here, Steve, now that we're up on the hour mark on this? I think this is a really fun exercise, and it is, like you said, it's a tool that shouldn't be ignored because PLV has that granularity, and it kind of takes a lot of biases out of it. So I am definitely my perceptions are starting to be colored when I look at exercises like this for March drafts.
Yeah. It's exciting. And I think that, especially for pitchers, it's going to be extremely useful. Excited to have Kyle on to dive into it more, maybe get some more specific thoughts on some players. Or narrow down our list a little bit, and then maybe get some of his feedback on how he crafts these. He was also on the Wire podcast a few weeks ago when these projections first came out. So be sure to check that out too on the Pitch List Podcast Network. But yeah, man, I got the itch too. I think I'm going to be doing either a Gladiator or a DC relatively soon.
Let me know, dude. I'm rested now. I'm ready to jump in. There I was. I was
Love
like,
it.
I'll wait until after the holidays. No,
Yeah.
I'm in.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's have Kyle on once we get
Yeah.
V2 of this, that like maybe he'll
For
do
sure.
it with
For sure.
playing time rolled in or something
Yeah.
like that. But
Yep.
yeah, this is a lot of fun. And yeah, we will be back in a couple weeks. And we'll keep that every other week cadence. But yeah, if you guys are still plugged in, be sure to keep your ears out for the podcast drop with us talking with Nick about our mock draft. That was a fantastic hour and a half.
We'll be back on Thanksgiving, so we got to do a thanks. We were Halloween this year. We're going to be Thanksgiving, right? Thanksgiving is the 28th or the 20? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
28th. No, you got it. What were we thankful for?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There we go.
What will we be thankful for?
Maybe we got to talk to Adam to try and get a Christmas. Yeah, we can release on Christmas potentially. I know it's a Wednesday this year, but hey, we'll be off by one day, so maybe it'll still work.
We'll workshop it. Maybe it's like advice now we'll be thankful for in draft season. Something. We'll work on it, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that signs us off for episode 161. Again, you guys can follow us on Twitter as usual at Wins Above Pod, at Van_verified, at Stav8818. Blue Sky, new beginnings, fresh slate, and some really good vibes and pitcher list action, as well as fantasy baseball action across the industry. You guys can follow us there. Steve is at Stav8818 per usual. I'm at Van_verified, no underscore, and we're at Wins Above Pod. But that wraps us up for episode 161, talking PLV projections. Thanks as always for talking baseball with us.
Thanks, guys. Later.